I was wrapping my mother's good china in newspaper, one plate at a time, corners first, the way I've packed 10,000 strangers' kitchens, when I heard my father give my home away. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and a roast going dry. Through the thin wall in the dining room, my dad raised his voice so the whole table could hear him. He said the condo would be a Christmas gift for my sister's family. A real home for the grandkids, he said. Settled after the new year. Nobody had asked me. I owned that place. I paid for it to the last dollar, with my own name on the deed and nobody else's. And I stood there at the sink with a wrapped plate in my hands, and I smiled. I even clapped, soft and even like everybody else. And then I did the one thing none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Suspense Calm Stories. I'm Robin, I'm 35, and I run a downsizing business. I'm the person families call when somebody dies, or somebody can't climb the stairs anymore, and a whole house has to become a small apartment in a week. I walk through other people's homes for a living and help them decide what to keep, what to sell, and what to let go. This is the story of the Christmas my own family decided which pile I belonged in. They put my whole life in the let go box, and what it cost them. If you have ever been treated like your life belongs to everyone but you, stay with me to the end, because the way this turned around is the reason I'm telling it. Drop a comment, type the word yours if you've ever owned one thing that was only yours, and please subscribe. I drove out to my parents' house every Christmas Eve with a pie on the passenger seat and a check in my coat pocket. The pie was for the table. The check was for my dad's medical bills, the ones he never quite paid off and never quite mentioned. I'd been writing that kind of check for years. Somewhere along the way it stopped being a gift and started being a job. I was the reliable one, the single daughter, the one who handled things. When the water heater died, they called me. When the property taxes got scary, they called me. When my sister Kayla overdrew her account again in March, somehow that was my phone that rang too. I never minded enough to say no. That was the whole problem, though I didn't have the word for it yet. My parents, Marv and Joan, still lived in the ranch house on Lark Street, where I grew up, on a street where everybody knew everybody. The driveway was full that night. Kayla's minivan, my aunt's old sedan, and parked across the street, a rental truck. A big white box truck, the kind you book by the day. I remember thinking it was strange. Nobody moves in December. I parked, balanced the pie, and told myself I was tired and reading into things. I climbed the porch steps where my grandfather once knelt down and taught me to tie my shoes. I had no idea that by the end of that night, the house would feel like a place I had to defend myself in. My mother opened the door before I knocked, kissed my cheek, and said, "Your father has news." She was glowing. I should have asked what kind. Before I tell you what I heard through that wall, you need to understand what the condo was to me. And you need to understand my grandfather, because the two things are the same thing. His name was Earl. He was a stonemason for 51 years. He laid brick and block and stone all over our town, churches and schoolhouses, and the front steps of half the homes on the east side. His hands looked like the tools he used. When I was small, he'd press my palm flat against a wall he'd built and say, "Feel that? That's still standing because somebody got the footing right." Earl grew up in a house his own father built by hand. And when his father died, Earl was 19, and his aunts and uncles got together and voted to sell that house out from under him, split the money, and put him out. He never said it with any heat. He just told me once, plain, they had a meeting about my home, and I wasn't in the room. Don't you ever let anybody have a meeting about your home without you in the room. So when I started saving for a place of my own, Earl was the one who believed it before I did. I worked 2 jobs through my 20s. I ran the front office of a moving company by day and waited tables on weekends. I drove a car with a window that wouldn't roll down. Every raise I saved instead of spent. Every dollar of tips went into one account I never touched. When I finally had the down payment, I bought a 2-bedroom condo with morning light and a little balcony at 27, and I signed the closing papers alone. No husband, no co-signer, just my name. Earl came to the closing in his good shirt. He didn't say much, but a week later he showed up at my door with a folder, and inside it was a copy of my deed and a brick. An actual brick, one of his own, with the year scratched into the mortar. He'd troweled onto the back of it himself, and a single word under the year. Yours. He set it on my counter, and he said the only piece of advice he ever really gave me twice. Build something with your name in the mortar, something nobody gets to vote you out of. And the first thing you put your name on is yourself. He died 3 years before this story. I want you to remember the folder. We're going to need it. The condo was not square footage to me. It was the footing Earl was always talking about. It was proof that the quiet girl who carried everyone else's boxes could stand on her own ground. My family came to the housewarming. They admired it. They ate my food. And then, I think, they quietly filed it away as something that belonged to all of us. A family asset. A spare room that happened to have my name on it by some accident of paperwork. I didn't know they thought that, not until the kitchen. Dinner that Christmas Eve was loud in the good way, at first. 11 of us around a table built for 8. My dad sat at the head with the look he got when he had a card to play. Halfway through the ham, he tapped his glass and said he had a special announcement, but it would wait until everyone was finished eating. My sister caught her husband's eye across the table. Mason grinned into his plate. Mason had run a fitness studio, one of those gyms with the ropes and the tires, and it had folded in the fall and taken a lot of borrowed money down with it. The kids, Dylan and little Posey, kept asking if the news was a puppy. Then Mason leaned toward me, easy as anything, and asked whether my condo could ever be sublet, hypothetically, if a person wanted to. I told him I owned it outright, so I could do whatever I liked with it, and I changed the subject. He nodded like I'd confirmed something. Kayla smiled down at her plate. My mother got up to start the coffee with a spring in her step I hadn't seen in a long while. I told myself families ask nosy questions. I told myself that truck across the street belonged to a neighbor. I carried a stack of plates into the kitchen because that was my role. And that was where the night cracked in half. The kitchen shared a wall with the dining room, and the wall was thin, and my mother's voice carried. She was talking to Kayla, low and warm, the way she talks when something is already decided. She was saying the kids could each have their own room. She was saying Mason could put his equipment in the 2nd bedroom. She was saying they'd move in after the new year so the children could start fresh at the better school across town. For a few seconds, my brain refused to put the words together. They were talking about my condo, my morning light, my balcony, my grandfather's brick on my counter. Then my mother said the thing I will hear for the rest of my life. She said it in that gentle, reasonable tone, the one that makes cruelty sound like kindness. She said, she'll understand. She doesn't need all that space. It's just her. I want you to sit with that, because of what I do for a living. You don't need all that space. It's just you. That is my line. It's the exact sentence I say, gently, to an 80-year-old widow on the first morning of a downsizing, helping her let go of the house where she raised 4 children. I'd spent my whole career saying those words to help strangers let go with dignity. And here was my own mother, using my words like a key to let my family into my home without me. I set the plates down very carefully so they wouldn't clatter. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected rage, and instead I felt a cold, clean quiet, the way the air goes still right before real weather. I understood, standing there, that this was not a plan they were going to ask me about. It was a plan they had already finished. The asking had been skipped on purpose, because somewhere in their hearts they were sure I'd say yes. I always said yes. I dried my hands and walked back toward the dining room just as my father was getting to his feet. He tapped his glass until the room went quiet, and he looked happier than I'd seen him in years. He said the family had been through a hard stretch. He said Mason's business had dried up, and the kids needed a yard, and a real home, and some stability. And then he said that he and my mother had decided to give Kayla's family the condo. He said it like a king handing out land. Everyone turned to look at me, because of course the condo was mine. There was a half second where the whole table held its breath to see what I'd do. My sister was already crying happy tears. The kids were cheering. Mason had his arm around her and his eyes on me, and there was something in his face that wasn't gratitude. It was a dare. My father lifted his glass toward me and said the words that became the second knife of the night. It settled, just like that, as if my signature were a formality, as if my ownership were a feeling. And here is the part I still think about. I smiled. I lifted my own glass. I clapped, soft and even like everyone else. I said, "What a Christmas." My mother beamed. My father sat back down, satisfied, sure he'd read me right one more time. Kayla mouthed, "Thank you," across the table, and I let her. Because in that moment, I understood something with total clarity. If I argued, I would become the villain, the selfish single aunt who put square footage over her own nieces and nephews. They had built the trap so that any honest reaction would prove their story. So I didn't react. I clapped. And I started, very quietly, to do the only thing I'm better at than they are. I started to make a plan. You learn something doing what I do. Every house I've cleared, the family thinks the fight will be about money. It never is. It's about who got to decide. People don't grieve a sofa. They grieve being voted on. I drove home that night with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mind already somewhere far up the road. I kept waiting to cry, and it didn't come. What came instead was a list. In my work, I make 3 labels for everything in a house. Keep, sell, let go. I sat at every red light, on the way home, sorting my own family into those 3 piles. And it terrified me how clear it was. They had decided my entire life went in the let-go box. My home, my years of saving, the one thing I'd built with nobody's help, and they hadn't asked, because asking would have meant admitting it was mine to keep. The worst part, the part that kept my hands cold and steady on the wheel, was that I had taught them to think this way. Every yes, every quiet rescue. I had trained my own family to treat my life as a shared supply closet. I didn't blame myself for being generous. I blamed myself for never once drawing a line until they forgot a line existed. I wasn't going to argue at a dinner table. Arguing was their game, and they'd stacked it. But I had my own trade, the one with checklists and timelines and clean, quiet work. And by the time I pulled into my own parking spot under my own balcony, I'd remembered an email I hadn't thought about in months. I woke up the morning after Christmas to a text from Kayla and a photo that turned my coffee to acid. The text said, "Thank you, sis. You have no idea what this means." The photo showed Dylan and Posey standing on the sidewalk outside my building, in their new Christmas coats, pointing up at my windows, grinning. Mason had driven them over on Christmas morning to let them pick which bedrooms would be theirs. They were choosing curtains for rooms in a home I had never agreed to give up. A second text came in while I was still staring at the first. Kayla asked if I could have the place empty by the 15th, because the kids' new semester started the 20th and they wanted time to settle in. Empty. She used the word like I was a storage unit they'd rented and were now reclaiming. And I want you to understand the irony of that, because making a house empty is my actual profession. I am very, very good at making a house empty. They just had no idea whose house I was about to do it to. I put the phone face up on the counter, made my coffee, and drank it slowly while it cooled. I was not frozen. I was deciding. Part of me wanted to call her and scream the truth, that she was planning the layout of a home she didn't own, that our parents had promised her my walls like they were theirs to promise. But I'd already learned the lesson at the dinner table. The moment I got loud, I lost. They'd circle the wagons around the crying sister and the out-of-work husband and the kids who'd already picked their rooms. And I'd become the cruel aunt who took bedrooms from children. So I texted back 2 words: "Talk soon." Then I opened my laptop and started looking for an email from a man named Russ Diller. Before I did anything irreversible, I gave them one chance. I owed myself that, even if I didn't owe them. I drove back out on the 27th and sat at my parents' kitchen table, the same table where the announcement had been made. I told them plainly, the condo was mine. My name was the only name on the deed. I'd paid for it myself, every dollar, and nobody had ever asked me whether I wanted to give it away. I kept my voice level. I wasn't there to fight. I was there to hold a door open for them, to walk through. My father's face went tight. He said I was making it about money when it should be about family. My mother reached across the table, patted my hand, and told me not to be selfish. She said Kayla needed it more. The kids needed it. I was young and single, and I could always buy another one someday. She said it so kindly. That was the thing that undid the last knot in me. She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely could not see why a home with my name on it wasn't simply available to whoever in the family was struggling most. To her, my line in the sand was the selfish thing, not the gift of my house. I looked at the 2 of them, and I understood the door was never going to open. They hadn't made a mistake I could correct with facts. They had a whole worldview, and in it, I existed to absorb the family's problems quietly. So I stopped explaining. If you've ever sat across a table from people who love you and realized they cannot hear you, you know the specific loneliness of that room. Hold onto that feeling. We're going to need it later. I told them I'd think about it, and I drove home to make a phone call. Mason showed up at my condo that evening without calling. I opened the door, and he was standing there in his coat with a tape measure clipped to his belt and the white rental truck idling at the curb. The same truck I'd seen across the street on Christmas Eve. He'd already booked it for January 1st. He asked if he could measure the 2nd bedroom for the kids' bunk beds, like the place was already his. I didn't let him in. He told me, friendly at first, that Marv had promised, that it was all arranged, that I shouldn't make this harder than it had to be. When I said the condo was not his to measure, the friendliness slid off his face like wet paint. He told me his creditors were calling his cell at dinner, that this home was the only thing standing between his kids and a worse apartment than the one they had now. And I felt for him. I did. That's the honest truth, and it's what made all of this so hard. Then he said the family had decided, and that I was outvoted, and that I needed to fall in line, outvoted, on my own home. I came so close, right then, to telling him exactly what I'd spent the afternoon arranging. The words were in my mouth. I wanted to wipe the entitlement off his face. But I swallowed it, because a loud win is a small win, and I wanted the kind that lasts. I told him to take his tape measure home, and I closed the door. Through it, I heard him say I'd regret this. I leaned my back against my own door, in my own home, and I almost laughed at how wrong he had it. The only thing I regretted was waiting so long. If you've ever been the one who always smooths it over, the one everybody counts on and nobody asks about, type "the bank is closed" in the comments, because that's the exact moment I'm about to tell you about. And if this story is reaching you, subscribe and stay with me, because the New Year's Eve part is coming. And it's the whole reason I'm telling you any of this. That night I sat on my own living room floor, back against the couch, and opened my laptop. Russ Diller was a buy-and-hold investor who'd knocked on doors in my building 8 months earlier, looking to pick up units to rent out. Most of us ignored him. He'd emailed me a polite, specific offer for my condo, cash, no contingencies, and I'd written back a polite no thank you, because I loved my home and had no reason to sell. I found the thread halfway down a folder. The offer was still there, in black and white. A real number, only a little under what the place might bring on the open market after months of showings. At the bottom, he'd written that the offer stood if I ever changed my mind, and left his number. I sat and looked at it for a long time. Selling would hurt. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. This was the place I painted myself, the place that proved I could stand alone, the place with Earl's brick on the counter. But I'd learned exactly what my family thought my home was for. As long as I held it, they would treat it as the family pantry, something to be raided whenever somebody was hungry. And I know better than almost anyone alive that you cannot give away what no longer exists. There was only one way to make that home truly, permanently mine in the only sense that mattered. I had to make it nobody's. I had to empty it. I am, after all, a professional. I copied Russ's number into my phone, but I didn't call yet. There was one boring legal fact I had to check first. The next morning I called Connie Alvarez, a sharp, no-nonsense real estate attorney I'd worked alongside. I asked her one question. If my name is the only name on the deed and the place is paid off, can anyone stop me from selling it? She actually laughed. She said, "Robin, it's your property. You could sell it to a stranger at the bus stop if you wanted. Nobody else gets a vote. Nobody else has to sign a thing." There it was. The whole thing my grandfather had tried to teach me, in one sentence from a lawyer who didn't even know my family. Nobody else gets a vote. I asked how fast a clean cash sale could close. No mortgage to pay off, clear title. She said with a motivated buyer and a good title company, you could be done in under a week. Maybe by the 30th, if everyone moved. I thanked her and hung up and sat very still. Then the second piece dropped into place. The one I'd been quietly carrying for 2 weeks and hadn't told a single soul. The woman who'd built the downsizing company I worked for, Gwen, was retiring. She'd offered to hand me the whole operation, but it meant moving to run her bigger office out in Denver. More money. A team of my own. A fresh start in a city where nobody had ever decided what I did and did not need. I'd been about to turn it down. Because of my family. Because of the checks and the rescues and the feeling that I was the one holding everybody together. Sitting on my floor with Connie's words in my ears and my sister's text still glowing on my phone, the fence I'd been sitting on simply disappeared. There was nothing holding me here that wasn't also holding me down. I could sell the condo, take the company, and start a life somewhere my name was the only name on it. All I had to do was move faster than my own family. I almost didn't do it. I want to be honest about that, because if I make myself sound certain the whole way through, you shouldn't believe me. That night I pulled out a cardboard box I'd carried through 4 moves and never unpacked. The bones of my 20s were in it. A photo of Earl squinting in the sun in front of a wall he'd just finished. His trowel, worn bright on one edge from 50 years of his hand, and under all of it, the folder. And I doubted myself, because this was still my family. My mother had braided my hair. My father had taught me to drive in an empty parking lot. Kayla and I had shared a bunk bed and whispered after lights out. Selling my home and vanishing to Denver felt enormous. It felt mean. It felt like the kind of thing you can't undo. I asked myself if I was overreacting, if I was punishing children for what their parents did, if a better daughter would just give a little and keep the peace. And then I opened the folder, and my doubt finally had something solid to stand against. Because Earl hadn't just left me a copy of the deed. Under it was an envelope I'd never opened. I'd been too overwhelmed the week I closed to do more than glance at it, and then life had filed it away. On the front, in his blocky, careful hand, he'd written, "Open this the day somebody tells you your home isn't really yours." I read the deed first, every line. Grantor, grantee, the legal description of the unit, and on the line that mattered, one name. Robin A. Keller, sole owner. Not my parents, not the family, not Kayla. Recorded at the county, stamped and filed and real. I ran my finger under my own name like a child learning to read. 6 years I'd owned this, and my family had managed to convince themselves the name was a technicality. Then I opened Earl's envelope. It was a single page, written the week I closed, as if he'd already seen this coming. And then he wrote this. I have it memorized now. Robbie, if you're reading this, somebody has decided your home belongs to them. They will tell you it's about family. It is about a meeting they had without you. Don't argue with them, sweetheart. You'll never win an argument with people who already voted. Do what I couldn't. Make it nobody's on your own terms before they can make it theirs. A house can be taken from you. A choice can't. Put your name on the choice. Yours, always, Grandpa. He had handed me, 3 years after his death, the exact plan I'd already started building on my own. He'd known me before I knew myself. He'd known this family before I let myself see it. I did not cry the loud way. I cried the quiet way, the way you do when something finally makes sense. Then I put the deed and the letter back in the folder, set the folder on my nightstand where I could see it, and I picked up my phone. It was time to call Russ Diller. He picked up on the second ring, even though it was the 27th, and most people were still in their holiday fog. I told him who I was, my unit number, and that if his offer still stood, I was ready to talk. There was a pause, and then I heard him smile through the phone. He said the offer stood, and that if anything the market had nudged up, so he could do a little better than the original number. He asked, careful, why the change of heart? I told him the truth, more or less. My circumstances had changed, and I needed to move fast and clean. He liked the word clean. Investors always do. He said if the title was clear and I was firm, he could have his title company open escrow the next day and close by the 30th. Cash. No financing to wait on. I said the 30th worked. I said it like I was confirming a dentist appointment, and inside my chest, something both broke and steadied at the same time. We agreed on the number before we hung up, and he texted me his attorney's information within the minute. I forwarded it straight to Connie and asked her to make sure every signature, every disclosure, every stamp was airtight, because I did not want one crack for anyone to argue through later. She wrote back one line. On it, and just like that, quietly, legally, the machine started to move. 3 days out from a New Year's Eve dinner, where my father planned to hand my sister a key to a home that would no longer exist for them to take. The next 2 days were the strangest of my life, because on the outside nothing happened, and underneath everything did. I went to work. I cleared an old farmhouse for a family whose mother had just gone into memory care, and I stood in her kitchen labeling her things, keep, sell, let go, with my own home in escrow across town. And I thought, I have done this my whole career for strangers, and I never once understood it until now. Meanwhile, escrow opened. The title company ran their search and confirmed what I already knew. Clean title. No liens, no co-owners, one name. Russ's attorney sent the purchase agreement, and I read every page twice, because I'm the kind of person who reads everything twice, and that habit was about to matter. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the silence I had to keep. My family thought I was sulking, but coming around. Kayla texted to ask if I'd settled on a moving date. My mother left a voicemail saying she knew I'd do the right thing. Every message assumed my surrender was just a matter of time, and I let them assume it. I didn't lie. I simply stopped explaining myself to people who had never once asked me a real question. There's a kind of power in that quiet I had never let myself use. All my life I'd over-explained, over-apologized. Now I just went still. A thumbs up, a short line, and the machine ran underneath it. If you're the one who always smooths things over, you know how unnatural it feels to stop. It felt like holding my breath underwater, but I was almost to the surface. The pressure got worse as the 30th got closer, the way it always does, right before people lose. Kayla called 4 times on the 29th. When I finally answered, she had the kids loud in the background, and her voice was sweet and tight at the same time. She wanted to know when she could get a key. She said the kids were so excited. Did I really want to break their hearts? There it was. The children set up like sandbags in front of her. I told her we'd talk after the new year, and I kept my voice as flat and warm as a closed door. My mother texted me a photo of curtains she'd bought for the kids' new rooms. She'd spent money she didn't have on curtains for windows she didn't own. I looked at that photo for a long time, and what I felt wasn't anger anymore. It was grief. Because these were people I loved, and they had walked so far out onto a branch that I could no longer warn them off it without becoming the villain for sawing it. They'd built this. Every assumption was a board they'd nailed on themselves. All I was going to do was stop holding the ladder. My father didn't text. My father didn't call. He was so certain it was settled that he saw no reason to check on me. And that, more than anything, told me I was doing the right thing. A man who truly believed the home was mine would have at least asked if I was okay. He never wondered. He'd already moved on to planning the toast. I knew there'd be a toast. I knew my father. And I was beginning to understand exactly how I'd answer it. The only call I actually wanted came from my Aunt Bev on the night of the 29th. Bev is my mother's younger sister, the one who says the quiet part out loud at every funeral. She called and asked, straight off, "Are you okay, honey?" And the question caught me so off guard, I almost couldn't answer. She was the first person in my family in days who'd asked how I felt instead of what I was going to give. She told me my father had been calling everyone, the cousins, the neighbors, the old crowd from church, telling all of them about the generous gift, the condo for Kayla's family, the proud grandfather making it right. She said he'd practically sold tickets to New Year's Eve so people could come watch him hand over the key. It didn't sit right with her, she said. She remembered me buying that place. She remembered how hard I'd worked. She remembered Earl helping me carry the couch up the stairs. I thanked her for asking, and I made a decision in that moment. I didn't tell her my plan because I trusted her heart, but not her ability to keep a secret in a family that runs on gossip. But I asked her one thing. I asked if she'd be at the dinner. She said she would. Good, I thought, because what I was about to do needed witnesses, and not the kind my father had invited to applaud him. I needed one person in that room who knew the truth of where that home came from, so that when the story got retold 100 times afterward, there'd be one voice that could say, I was there, and it did not happen the way Marv tells it. Bev was going to be that voice. She just didn't know it yet. The closing was at 9 in the morning on the 30th, in a small office that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. It took 40 minutes. That's the part nobody tells you. The thing that takes 10 years to build can change hands in 40 minutes with a pen and a notary and a stack of paper. I've watched it happen to 100 families from the outside. I'd just never been the one in the chair. I signed where the little flags pointed. Russ signed across from me, calm and pleased, a man who'd wanted this unit for 8 months and finally got it. The title officer slid the last page into a folder and told me the funds would hit my account by end of day. And then it was done. The condo was no longer mine. I drove back to the building one last time and let myself in with a key that wasn't really mine anymore. I stood in the empty living room I'd painted with my own hands. The morning light came through the balcony doors, the way it always had, completely indifferent to whose name was on the walls. I let myself feel the loss, because it was real. But here's the thing I tell every family on the worst morning of their lives. There is a world of difference between losing something and letting it go. Losing it is when someone takes it. Letting go is when you choose. I had not lost my home. I had let it go on my own terms. Earl's brick and Earl's folder were already in my car. I took one slow walk through the rooms, said goodbye to the balcony, and locked the door behind me for the last time. By the time Mason's rental truck pulled up on January 1st, there'd be a stranger's name on the buzzer and a stranger's lock on the door. But before that, there was a dinner. There was a toast to answer. That afternoon, while the sale money was landing in my account, Mason texted me one more time. Trucks booked for 9 a.m., Jan 1. See you there, bring the key. He didn't ask, he informed. I read it standing in my own half-packed apartment, boxes everywhere. The Denver job already accepted in an email I'd sent that morning. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say to a man planning to move into a home that had sold the day before. I could have let it end right there. I could have simply not shown up on New Year's Eve and let them drive to a stranger's locked door on the 1st. Let the truth arrive without me. It would have been cleaner, but I'm not built for clean disappearances. My family had made their decision in a crowded room on purpose, so the crowd would pressure me into yes. I decided the truth deserved the same audience, not purely for revenge. I won't insult you by pretending there was none in it, but mostly because I was so tired of being the quiet one who absorbed everything in private while they performed their version of events in public. I wanted to stand in the same light my father had chosen for his toast and say one true thing out loud. And then I wanted to leave and keep leaving all the way to Denver. So I made my decision. I'd go to the New Year's Eve dinner. I'd bring a folder instead of a key. I'd let my father stand up and make his proud announcement one last time, and then I'd stand up too. I picked out what I'd wear the way you pick armor, and I drove out to my parents' house one final time. The New Year's Eve dinner was even more crowded than Christmas. Streamers on the mantel. The good champagne my parents saved for weddings. Half the family there, and a few neighbors. Exactly like Bev had warned, Kayla and Mason sat near the head of the table like guests of honor. The kids were wired on soda and the promise of new bedrooms. I came in quietly, kissed my mother's cheek, set a covered dish on the counter like always. I had a slim folder tucked in my bag. I said almost nothing through dinner. I watched my father glow. I watched Mason lean back in his chair like a man who already had the keys in his pocket. I caught Bev's eye once, and she gave me a small, worried nod. When the plates were cleared, my father stood up and tapped his glass, and the room went obediently quiet. Because this was the moment he'd been advertising for a week. He talked about family. He talked about hard times and sticking together. And then he held up a single brass key on a ribbon, a prop he'd clearly bought for the occasion, and announced that as of the new year, Kayla's family would have a real home. The condo, his gift to his grandchildren. He looked right at me when he said the word gift, daring me to flinch. Then he said it again, the same line from Christmas, the one he thought was a closed door. It's settled. The kids have a home now. The room burst into applause. Champagne started pouring. Kayla was crying again, that easy, pretty crying. Mason reached out and took the brass key from my father's hand like it meant something. Everyone turned to me, waiting for the gracious aunt to smile and bless it, the way I had at Christmas. My mother watched me with hopeful, shining eyes. I set down my napkin. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I did not give them what they expected. I didn't raise my voice. That was the whole strategy, the only one that ever works on people who are counting on you to break. I waited until the applause died down on its own, until the curiosity in the room got heavier than the celebration. Then I spoke in the calm, even tone I used to deliver hard news to a grieving family. I said, before anyone gets too comfortable, there's something you all need to know. I opened the folder and laid 2 pieces of paper on the table, right next to the champagne. The first was a copy of my deed with my name and only my name highlighted. The second was the closing statement, dated December 30th, signed and stamped. I slid them down the table so my father could see them clearly. I said, "You can't give away something that was never yours." My voice did not shake. I said, "The condo was mine, my name, nobody else's, and it isn't mine anymore either. I sold it 2 days ago." The room didn't understand at first. There was a beat of confused silence, the kind where people glance at each other to check whether they heard it right. My father picked up the closing statement. I watched his eyes move down the page, to the date, to the signatures, to the one word at the bottom that finished it. Sold. His face changed slowly, like ice going gray before it cracks. Kayla stopped crying. Mason set the brass key down on the table with a small click that was somehow the loudest sound in the room. My mother put her hand over her mouth, and I just stood there, calm as a winter morning, and let the paper do what years of my explaining never could. I had spent my whole life trying to make them hear me with my voice. It turned out all I ever needed was a notarized date and the nerve to stop apologizing. The quiet held for one long second. Then it broke. Mason went first, the way I knew he would. He shot to his feet so fast his chair tipped over behind him. He slammed his hand flat on the table, and the glasses jumped. He shouted that I'd ruined his family, that I'd stabbed my own nieces and nephews in the back, that the truck was booked, the kids had picked their rooms. Who did I think I was? Spit flew. His face went red. Kayla was right behind him, crying for real now, the ugly kind, demanding how I could be so cruel, so cold, so selfish. The room I'd stayed so calm in turned into noise and pointing fingers. And at the center of it, I just stood there with my hands folded, which made them angrier, because there was nothing to push against. My father found his voice and roared that I had no right, that this was a family matter. How dare I? And that was when I handed them back the line, the one my mother had said through the kitchen wall on Christmas Eve. I waited for a gap in the shouting, and I said it quietly, so they had to go still to hear it. I said, for 2 weeks you've all been telling everyone I didn't need all that space, that it was just me. I let it land. Then I said, well, now none of us have it. The whole room went dead silent. Kayla's mouth opened and nothing came out. Mason's red face just hung there. My father sat down hard, like his legs had quit. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't insulted anybody. I'd simply handed them their own words back with the math attached, and the math was final. Across the table, Bev had both hands pressed to her chest, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was nodding. Nodding the way you nod when somebody finally says the true thing out loud. It was my mother who got to me, the way only a mother can. In the middle of all that noise, she didn't yell. She just looked at me with her hand still over her mouth and her eyes wet and confused, and she said in a small voice, "But honey, you always seemed so fine." And there it was, the whole thing in one sentence, with no villainy in it at all, just a lifetime of quiet assumption. She had decided I was fine. She decided it so long ago and so completely that it stopped being something she checked and became something she built on. My being fine was the foundation under all of it. The checks, the rescues, the giving away of my home, because Robin is fine. Robin doesn't need help. Robin doesn't need all that space. Robin will understand. I felt my throat go tight, but I didn't let it pull me off course, because softness here would undo everything. I looked at her and I said gently, "That was the problem, Mom. You decided I was fine, so my whole life became something you could spend." I told her I loved her, and I meant it, and that's what made it land. I told her I was done being the family's emergency fund. I told her, in the flat, certain voice of a woman reading a final balance, that the bank was closed. She started to cry, and part of me wanted to cross that room and hold her, the way I'd held this whole family together for a decade. I didn't. Some boundaries only count if you let the other person feel their full weight. The room had been comfortable at my expense for 35 years. It could sit in the discomfort for one night. I picked up my deed and my closing statement and slid them back into the folder, because they were mine to keep, like everything else I'd earned. Then I said the last thing I'd come to say, and I said it to the whole table. To the cousins and the neighbors and the people my father had invited to watch him be generous with my home. I told them the money from the sale was mine. I told them my life was mine. I told them I'd taken over a company in another city and I'd be gone within the week. I said I would always be their family, but I would never again be their account. And then I reached into my coat pocket and took out the spare key to my parents' house, the one I'd carried for years, so I could let myself in at any hour and be the reliable one. I set it on the table, next to Mason's useless brass prop. I said, "I think you can all manage from here." I thanked my mother for dinner because she had still cooked it, and manners outlive everything. And I walked out. Nobody followed me at first. The room was too stunned to move. As I reached the door, I heard Bev's voice behind me, clear and steady, saying to the table, "She's right, you know. I remember her buying that place." I watched Earl carry her couch up those stairs. Not one of you helped her. That was the witness I'd come for. I stepped out into the cold, and the night air hit my face. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my chest felt wide open instead of clenched. I got in my car. I did not look back at the house. I'd already seen everything in it I needed to. I left for Denver on the morning of January 1st, my car packed to the roof, the sunrise in my mirrors. Earl's brick road on the passenger seat where the pie used to go. Somewhere in the second hour, my phone started to light up, and it didn't stop. By the time I pulled over for gas at noon, the screen said 79 missed calls. I sat in the station lot and scrolled through them once, just once, before I turned the ringer off for good. Mason had called 11 times, and his voicemails went from threats to bargaining and back to threats. Kayla had called and texted in long, weepy paragraphs about how I'd broken her children's hearts, never once mentioning that she'd planned to take my home without asking. My mother called the most, and her voicemails were the only ones I listened to twice. In the last one, she wasn't angry. She just said, "Please call me back, honey. Please." And I sat there in that cold parking lot and let myself feel how much I loved her and how I still wasn't going to call. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. And then there was the one I never expected. My father called once late, and for the first time in my entire life, he left a message. My father does not apologize. He waits for the world to come back to him. But on that recording, his voice was old and small, and he said, "You were right, Robbie. I knew whose name was on that place. I always knew. I just decided it didn't matter, and that was wrong of me. Your grandfather would be ashamed of me, and he'd be proud of you. Drive safe." That one I listened to 3 times. It didn't fix anything. But it was the truest thing my father had said to me in 35 years, and I let myself keep it. The only message I answered was from Aunt Bev. It said, "You did the right thing, and I'm proud of you, and don't you dare let them tell you otherwise." I wrote back, "Thank you." Then I turned off the ringer and drove. The fallout, in the plain accounting of it, looked like this. Kayla's family did not get a condo because there was no condo to get. Mason returned the rental truck and paid the cancellation fee out of money he didn't have. My parents had to explain to every cousin and neighbor and churchgoer they'd bragged to that the generous gift had simply evaporated because it was never theirs to give. And for the first time in years, when something in that family broke, the phone that rang was not mine. I want to be honest. I did not feel triumphant. I felt quiet. I felt like a person who'd finally stopped bailing water out of a boat she didn't even own and stepped onto dry land and was surprised to find it held her weight. Out in Denver, I run Gwen's company now, my name on the door. I spend my days walking strangers through the hardest week of their lives, sorting a whole house into 3 piles. Keep, sell, let go. And I've gotten better at it since that Christmas, because now I understand what I'm really asking of people. I'm not asking them to give things up. I'm asking them to be the one who decides. Earl's brick sits on the windowsill of my new place, the year and that one word still scratched in the mortar. Yours. And on the wall above my desk, framed, is the letter he wrote me for a night he knew was coming. Make it nobody's on your own terms, before they can make it theirs. Put your name on the choice. Here is the only lesson I took from all of it, and I'll give it to you the way Earl gave me things. Plain and once. Loving your family does not mean letting them treat your life like a spare room they get to move into. You are allowed to own one thing nobody else gets to vote on, and it starts with yourself. They can have a meeting about your home. They cannot have a meeting about your name unless you let them in the room. So check whose name is really on your life. And if the wrong people have been voting on it, you are allowed to close the bank, lock the door, and let it go on your own terms. That's where I'll leave it tonight. The china on the counter, the toast with my home in it, the brass key nobody ever got to use, and 79 calls I never returned. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. This is Suspense Calm Stories. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one everybody counts on and nobody asks about, tell me in the comments where you finally drew your line. If this reached you tonight, subscribe and stay with us, because there's always another story about the quiet ones who finally stopped saying yes. Take care of yourself and put your name on something.